Hello. Today I wanted to make a video discussing Elden Ring, specifically the character stat discovery. I wanted to make this video because I have some criticisms about character improvement and leveling as a whole for the game, but I am not a Soulsborne veteran, and my breadth of understanding and experience with these games is a bit lacking given that I've only played one playthrough of Sekiro and Elden Ring each. And therefore, I don't feel comfortable tackling this discussion across all the different attributes and character stats. But I feel that it would still be interesting to discuss the stat discovery itself. And part of the reason that I want to hone in on discovery is due to the fact that when I got into Elden Ring, I specifically made my character with the intent of raising my discovery quickly. Later on, I learned that discovery was not a very powerful stat, and I did some digging and I did some calculations, and I learned just to what extent the overall impact discovery has, which is what I want to share in this video. Now, before I begin my real discussion getting into the weeds of what discovery is and how it affects your gameplay, I wanted to add a little bit of backstory as to how I got to buying my own copy of the game and starting my own character. I have a friend who really got hooked on From Software's games with Sekiro, and he did eventually buy Elden Ring, and he enjoyed it a lot. And so initially, I had gained a little bit of interest off of his opinions of the game and how he thought it was an excellent game. But I wasn't fully convinced I wanted to buy Elden Ring just yet, which is when I went to one of my favorite content creators, Otstarva. He does Twitch streams and YouTube, and I knew that he had made an Elden Ring playthrough playlist on his YouTube channel, and I watched through most of his playthrough, and his playthrough really convinced me to pull the trigger and to buy the game. Shout out to Otstarva. He is, from my best understanding, just a great guy, really nice and a great entertainer, really educational about the games that he plays. Uh, as of this taping, he is currently doing a challenge on Dead by Daylight called the All Perk Streak, a unique challenge that he made for himself that he has a lot of fun with. And he's been also playing Dark Souls 2, but the full game is randomized, the items, the enemies, and the bosses. And the challenge that he set for himself is a permadeath. So each run, if he ends up dying, he has to restart and he re randomizes everything in the game. I highly recommend you check out his Twitch. He streams quite frequently, and if you're interested in his videos, he also makes a lot of high quality videos on his YouTube. I'll put links in the description down below. By the time in watching Otstarva's Elden Ring playthrough that I was convinced to buy a copy of the game for myself, I knew that I wanted to learn about the different starting classes and what the attributes did for you. From Software is, of course, notorious for not holding your hand, which is where a lot of people really enjoy their games. And although it does add some level of fun, I wanted to make sure that I set the tone and pace that I wanted for my early game in a way that was going to benefit me. And So I, after a bit of research, learned that Arcane sounded like a good starting point for me to invest my runes and my levels because it affected item discovery. And I learned that item discovery improves the rate at which items drop from enemies that you defeat. And so in my research, I made the determination that I was going to pick the bandit and that my runes and my levels were going to be spent on investing heavily into arcane. Midway through the game, after doing a little bit more research, I learned that it is a cardinal sin to invest so many levels into one particular attribute. Uh, by the point I learned that information, it really didn't bother me too much because I didn't necessarily try to play the game in a meta way. And so by the end of my playthrough, defeating the final boss of the base game, to give you some sense of where my attributes were at, my highest attribute was arcane at 90, and my second highest attribute was actually a tie between vigor and endurance at 40. So obviously, I could have diversified my attributes more, but for a decent bit of the game, I liked the idea of having a high discovery. And by the time I learned that that discovery is not that impactful, I still liked the idea of just reaching the maximum level for arcane anyway. All right. The first thing I want to dive into is the lack of transparency with regard to discovery. Obviously, you can go into the menu and read an explanation, a brief one sentence explaining the purpose of discovery, but the purpose does not have anything to do with a reference to understand what a good discovery number is. You start in the low 100s depending on your class when you first create a character, but you can see from the screenshot that my discovery is 191. However, that level of discovery isn't even that amazing. It's decent, but it's not superbly good. And I would say that this lack of transparency just makes it hard unless you do a lot of testing within game or you do a lot of research online to gauge the overall value of discovery. There is the very obvious benefit, which I concede is certainly good, which is with regard to the saying, uh, never learn how the sausage is made. And for some players, understanding the hidden mechanics at play within a game can take away from the magic of the experience of playing. However, I personally don't feel that way, but there are certainly people out there that do feel that way. The other benefit of not giving you an exhaustive explanation of discovery within the game is for new players or players in general, if they were to go through and explain that stat as well as other stats, it could be a bit overwhelming and it could disinterest them in trying to understand what it is they're looking at. These short menu explanations are a lot more concise and easier to digest for the brain. Unfortunately, due to the lack of transparency, there were probably other players like me that did not understand what Discovery was doing for them and invested into it anyway, and were probably disappointed as well when they realized their return on investment was not what they had hoped or expected. And this is due to the hidden formula within the game. Now, I need to address a disclaimer before I get into what this formula is. And the disclaimer is that I do not know for certain that this formula is the one used for the game. The formula, from my best guess, originated on the Elden Ring fandom wiki whoever had posted it there on the discovery page. However, I've not, from my research, found any sort of verification from like a From Software developer confirming that that's the formula used within the game. So we need to, for the purpose of this video and this discussion, assume the premise to be true that the formula taken from the Elden Ring fandom wiki is in fact correct. Now, the formula in question I've put on the screen, and if you want to see the full page from the Elden Ring wiki, you can go there. I will put a link in the description to get to that page quickly from this video. But the formula itself, for somebody who maybe math isn't their strongest subject, might look a little scary or intimidating or confusing. But it's relatively straightforward. You can see the two variables they used, capital B representing the base item drop chance, and that is representative of your item discovery essentially not influencing the drop chance at all. That is the true drop chance if you are at 100 item discovery. But of course, it is on two separate fronts on this formula multiplied by your item discovery, and that is represented by the capital D. They divide your item discovery already with the variable by 100, but I will be graphing this and you will see that visually the formula is going to look different because I didn't already preemptively do that step. So there's going to be a couple divided by 100s in the formula on the graph that I use. All right, we can see here that I have my function on the left and I have the graph on the right, and the item discovery function does look a bit different, but it is essentially the same. If you'd like to see item discovery on a graph, you can find a different graph somebody else had made calculating item discovery. It's a lot more sophisticated. I will put it in the link. I will link it in the description of this video. But for the purpose of this video, I'm going to use my graph. We can see though that instead of having a capital V value representing base item drop chance, I'm using an X value. That's because we have an X axis down here, and instead of the capital D, like I made mention, we are using a D divided by 100. This off to the side limits the graph from exceeding 1 on the y-axis and going below 0 on the y-axis. And that is because the y represents the true item drop chance when we calculate the function here. And that drop chance, of course, is on a scale from 0% to 100%. So you can imagine if we multiply these values by 100, that is where we're getting. So 20%, 40%, 60%, 80%, 100% on the y-axis here. Now, when we get into actually looking at each individual base item drop chance, we have this table of x values with regard to the function. And when we look at the x values on this graph, we can see all these little orange dots that represents each individual x value on the graph. And if we zoom in, we can see that at a 1% drop rate, that the result of it is 1%. And that even if we jump up to 20 here, a 20% base drop rate yields a true 20% drop rate. And that's because if we scroll down on the left, we have a slider. This slider influences our item discovery up top in the function, And we can see clearly that this slider starts at 100. Well, of course, 100 divided by 100 is just 1. And so the x value, whatever it is, times 1 is just going to be the x value. And so that is where I made mention earlier that if you're at 100 item discovery, that it does essentially nothing for you. The true drop chance is the drop chance without any sort of discovery influencing it. That's why we have a linear graph here with a D value of 100. I apologize for the lagginess of the graph. My computer can only handle so much. But let's say that we want to change our D value. Let's change it to 145. Now we can see that as we raise it, in general, each point on this graph goes up, but the graph curves. It does not stay linear, it curves up. And that is the nature of this function. And we can see that if we were to take a 40% x value, the y value is now 49%. So with 145 discovery, our base 40% drop chance of getting whatever item is now nearly a 50%. And if we go up to 80, the 80 has jumped all the way to 85. If we look down here at a lower value at 6%, for example, it jumps from 6 to 8. Now, if you're recognizing something that seems maybe a little underwhelming, it's the overall improvement on the drop chance. A 6 to 8 is a plus 2%. A 40 to a 49 is a plus 9%, and an 80 to an 85 is only a 5% increase. And if we also look at the nature of this D slider, we can see that once we get to a certain level of item discovery, that our graph only starts increasing very little at the top end. Even at the middle, it starts slowing down, it starts plateauing in how much our D is really influencing it. And so if we look at our 40%, it's jumped up quite a few points at 334 discovery. 4 to 0.69, 40% to nearly 70% is quite the jump. But let's take a look at 60. We can see here that 29 points for the 40 versus 23, that's not nearly as significant. And if we look at 80, it's only jumped 13 points. So we can begin to see a little bit of a pattern here. Now, I want to also take a look at the low levels of base drop chance. Let's look at 1. When we are at 1% drop chance for an item, it only jumps 2 points and some change. That is 3.26%. At a 2% base drop chance, it jumps up to 6.38%. That is not terribly significant. And mind you, getting to 334 item discovery is very challenging. You not only need maximum arcane, but you also need to be equipped with the silver scarab talisman, as well as eating the silver pickled fowl foot or the DLC consumable item that also increases your discovery. And I made this graph a time ago, and I noticed that the behavior of this graph has two problems, at least in my point of view. The first problem is that by the nature of this graph and this function, the most important number in calculating the true item drop chance is the X value. That is the base item drop chance. It has the most weight in affecting the outcome of the true item drop chance. And you can see that if I have a low item discovery, let's just say 140, at a 2%, it jumps up less than a full percent. We're only at 2.77. But even at a max discovery, it's only jumped to 6.38. And that goes to show that even with a super rare item, your max item discovery is not doing a significant amount for you, right? If you're killing one enemy and resetting at a 6.3% chance, it's like 1 in 16. And if that enemy is not close to a site of grace, right, you could be eating a bit of time if you really want to get this one item. But let's look at a different section of the graph, and let's set it at 150 here. We can see that up at 90%, the graph is indicating that your true item drop chance slows down. I mentioned this before, it starts plateauing. That 3% bump at a 90% is not really doing much for you, which would, if you think about it, kind of makes sense due to the fact that you don't really want your numbers exceeding 100%, then it's kind of being wasted. But at a 99, it's only going up by 331. That is a 99.331% chance. So the overall influence is coming from the base item drop chance. If the base item drop chance is already high, then it means that this graph is, or the graph indicates that there's already going to be a rock solid chance that you get it, and that the influence of the number is from your discovery is not that significant. If it's low, then it's also insignificant in the sense that you're not additively really dramatically raising it. With this relationship, it creates a problem where you cannot have your cake and eat it too. And what I mean when I say that is, if you look at the increase at the low end of the graph, a 2% jumping to a 2.97%, additively, that's a very small increase, but proportionally, that's quite large. 3 versus 2, that's nearly a 150% increase in size. And when we divide our base item drop chance by the true item drop chance, right, 66% of this increase is coming from the base item, which means 33% of the Y value is coming from our discovery, which is pretty significant. But if we look at a higher number, if we look at 6 here, at a 60%, we nearly jump to 70%. And when you divide 60 by 69, you get basically 87%, which means 87% of the true item drop chance is coming from our X value, our base item drop chance. And only 13% is coming from our discovery, our D value. If we go even higher to 80%, 80 divided by 85 is even more in favor of the X value. That, off of quick math, is 16 divided by 17. I don't know that fraction off the top of my head. 94. We get 94% from our X value, the base item drop chance. And only 6% of this is coming from the D value. And you can see, though, that the additive bonus is stronger. This is a 0.97 additive bonus, like flat increase. This is a 9.2 flat increase, and this is a 5.7 flat increase. So on this graph, we can see that at the low end, the additive flat bonus is small, but the proportional bonus is large. Once we get midway, we start getting a larger flat bonus, but the proportional bonus is decreasing. And once we reach a certain threshold, not only is the proportional decrease getting smaller, but the flat bonus also starts shrinking. So I really want to focus in on the proportional inefficiencies of this formula. While the flat rate bonuses do matter, the proportional changes to this graph are what's probably my biggest problem with the overall design of the formula. Now, I've added a few x values here for the purpose of explaining this, and we'll get into this in a second. But at 100 discovery, we already know that it's essentially nullified. When we do the math, of course, 100 divided by 100, that just leaves a 1, and x times 1 is just going to be x on the top. X times 1 on the bottom is just going to be x, which leaves the 1 minus x plus x down here. A negative x added to an x cancels each other out, and that leaves you with an x over 1, which of course just means x. And that's where you get y equals x. So we understand that this graph is in fact linear. And we can show this visually when we remove our limitations here on the y value. You can see that even going into the other quadrant, this is a perfectly straight line. And our table proves as much. But let's increase our discovery by 1 point. Now, this still looks like a linear graph, but it isn't. And we know this by looking at our x values. We can see that the y values have capped, and quite dramatically. At 4,000, we're capped at 98. At 5,000 at 99, and at 6,000 it's 99.3. At 1 million, it's 100.98. We can just say, presumably, that this function, given the current parameters, that as x approaches infinity, y is approaching basically 101. We don't have to get into the full calculus of it, but I think it's easy to say around 101. Well, let's increase this value by one additional point. Already we can see that these y values have been cut in half, right? We are stuck at 50 and some change. This is 50.997 at a 1 million x value. And so, roughly speaking, as x approaches infinity, the y is approaching 51. Now, you might be asking, why does it matter what these x values are when they're so high? They're literally above the 100% base drop chance. But we'll see when we take this up, the discovery up higher, that this graph starts getting pressed a lot more. Let's take it to I'm trying to get 125 here. We'll just enter it manually. We can see that our graph has started bending visually a little bit. It's not super dramatic, but when we look at our y values, this range has shrunk a lot. And getting 25 points of discovery is not that crazy. We can see that we are stuck within thousandths of decimals here. 4.995 at 4,000, 4.999 at 1 million. But let's just say that you've got 0 discovery from your arcane, and let's just say that you have eaten 1 silver pickled fowlfoot, which gives you a plus 50. Now the y values are compressed even more. This is such a small difference on these y values compared to the x values. And even if we look at the top end at 0.01 yielding a 0.014, even that difference in y value is pretty dang small. Now let's say you ate the silver pickled fowlfoot and you have equipped the silver scarab talisman, granting you 225 discovery. We've shrunk even more here. 1.79 is the limit, right? 1.8 really is the limit. And our graph has started bending a lot more. Let's take it all the way up to 334. This graph has bent a lot, and we can see that we are limited to under 1.43. This range has shrunk, and this graph, when you look at its behavior, it tapers off under a certain limit. And the efficiency of that tapering gets worse as your D is higher, right? When we take it all the way back down, this tapering takes a really long time, from 0 to 34 at 103. At 101, it was tapering at just under 101 on the Y value. And you can see that the range has shrunk for each extra point. This shows that our efficiency in our discovery is getting worse over time. And that relationship means that for each extra point of discovery that you have gets worse than its previous point. What I have been dancing around in this video at length now is the concept of diminishing returns. Now we can see at a max item discovery that the limits of our Y value are pressed very low. They can't exceed 1.43. And the lower our discovery, the greater our limits. We can see at 128 here that our Y value is pressed at 4.57, probably won't be able to exceed 5. And if we look at even lower, our limits are now 34 at a discovery of 103. Not only does our limits lower, but the amount of X values needed to even get close to our limits also gets reduced. And we can see here, taking it to a discovery of 100, that the Y value limit is the same as the X value limit. It's infinity on both. So approaching it from both the X value and the Y value perspective has a perfect ratio. The efficiency of reaching the X and the Y is the exact same. But reaching the X value infinity compared to the Y value 1.43, well, you're going to get close to achieving the 1.43 a lot faster than you are infinity. And so this concept of diminishing returns indicates that our points invested into discovery, whether it be through upgrading arcane or using items, become less efficient. Now, the notion of diminishing returns in Elden Ring is not unique to discovery. You can find soft caps and diminishing returns across all of the attributes for the character and the stats that they impact. However, I do think that the diminishing returns for discovery are a bit more punishing, especially considering what discovery actually does for your character. I will acknowledge from a game dev standpoint that these diminishing returns are an effective way of preventing your character from becoming too powerful, being able to bulldoze through a majority of the content without much in the way of skill or strategy. But from a player perspective, it is very demotivating for me knowing that my character's plateauing and they're plateauing at a very aggressive rate. Now, circling back to discovery, I want to address a couple ideas I had in the way of changing some of the game's design to make discovery more impactful for the player. The first idea I had in mind for the game devs to change discovery is with regard to not the formula itself, but actually the base item drop chance. From what I saw on the Elden Ring wiki, one of the lowest, if not the lowest, drop chances in the game is 2%, and it's quite common given that a lot of the weapons and armor in the game drop at a 2% rate. They could raise the minimum floor to make farming less tedious and to make situations where you got impeccable luck less important. From my own playthrough of the game, I had two cases where I spent a decent bit of time farming that I'd like to share. The first of which was in southern Limgrave in the castle where the Misbegotten have taken over the area. I wanted to get the bow and the axe, the heavy axe that the Misbegotten were carrying. And per reset of the area, I was killing three of the Misbegotten with the bow and arrow equipped, as well as the two Misbegotten carrying the large axes. And in total, it took me an hour and a half to get the bow to drop, an additional 30 minutes for the axe to drop. And at the time, I was relatively early into my playthrough with only 40 points of arcane and no other bonuses in discovery. And with this situation, it's easy to point out that my discovery was not very high. With regard to the formula, that 2% was only a 2.7. And I think that's a fair criticism to point out that if I wanted to get the items faster, I could have eaten the silver pickled fowl foot. I could have tried to go pick up the silver scarab talisman. But I'll address another situation where I was much higher level. I was actually in Caelid, in Western Caelid at the fort on the western end of Caelid where there's two Gelmir Knights. I was trying to complete the Gelmir Knight set. I had two pieces and I just wanted to complete the set, so I wanted to grab the other two. And in my quest for getting the full set, it took me anywhere from 30 minutes to 45 minutes. I unfortunately was not keeping super close track of time. But I was killing these knights in roughly 45 seconds. And across this span of time, killing two knights in 45 seconds, if we're doing this based off rough estimations, I killed anywhere from 80 to 150 of those knights during that time frame. And at this point, I had about 80 arcane, giving me 80 points of discovery, and I was in fact using the silver scarab talisman, raising my discovery by an additional 75 points. I had in total about 255 discovery, and at once again a 2% drop rate, I still had to kill that many knights over that period of time. Going back to my idea, if they raise the minimum threshold both of these instances would theoretically have been expedited, and I wouldn't have had to spend so much time tediously grinding. But you could argue that under the current system, in both cases, I actually got lucky in that it didn't take that much time at all. If you ended up grinding for an item that had a super low drop rate, feel free to comment your own tedious farming, and let everyone know how painstakingly long it was for you. Now, I will move on and address a very obvious flaw of this design, and that is if they raise the minimum drop rate threshold at 2%, if they raise it to, let's just say, 6%, it would create a problem where the dev team would realistically need to reevaluate the drop rate for items across the whole game, because it could otherwise create a problem where items that have a 6% drop rate under the current system are now being compared to items that had a 2% or a 3% or 4% drop rate. And comparing these items off drop rate alone would not give the full story and their impact and what their uh, overall value to the character is. And so it could create this situation where two items with the same drop rate don't really feel equivalent otherwise. And so that would be a lot of extra time and effort on the dev team's part. Moving on to my next idea, this one would be addressing the formula itself. Instead of using the current formula, which has the diminishing returns for increased discovery, I think that the discovery system could be a constant rate where for every 1 point of discovery, you could, as an example, have 0.1% bonus item drop chance across the board. This would be theoretically stronger and overall better for the player, assuming that the number that they use is not so small that it's overall worse. But even still, if they wanted to make it less than 0.1%, let's say they made it 0.02%, it could still potentially come out overall to be more impactful on the low end of the game's design, considering that you can get up to 334 discovery. It could still overall make the lowest drop rate items a lot easier to get to avoid, once again, the problems of this impeccable luck or excessive farming. Now, this system isn't perfect either. I don't want to pretend that having the flat rate bonuses is objectively better than what the game currently uses, but the problems that it would have would be that it would share the same proportional problem, although depending on the numbers, it could actually be worse. Where at higher levels of base drop rate, the proportionality could be worse. I think, given the impact at the lower base drop rates, it would still be overall better. The other problem, though, is that because it would be a flat rate, that's where the pattern lies. That the increases in drop rate would also not be proportional. And the true drop rate would look a bit cattywampus, and statistically, it would make items feel awkward in how often they're dropping. Where the current system, regardless of what your item discovery is going to be, super rare items are still going to be super rare, semi rare items are still going to be semi rare, and pretty common items are still going to be pretty common. It's just that they're proportionally increasing with the more discovery you have. In a flat rate bonus system, it would make the super rare items kind of rare, and it would make the semi rare items super common. And so that would be the obvious drawback aside from making the proportional efficiency lower. I still believe that this system would overall be stronger, however. The last idea I had is a little bit more experimental, and it would be also a little bit more complicated as it would actually be implementing entirely new system mechanics rather than replacing what we currently have or adding on to what we currently have. This last idea would be actually to expand the concept of luck in the game beyond just discovery. Now, I think although it would be a poor comparison, looking at this game that I'm about to reveal would be a good way to get ideas on how they could expand luck in Elden Ring. Now, the game in question that I want to briefly mention is Fallout 4. While the Fallout 4 and Elden Ring are completely different games, they both have a system of endlessly leveling up where you can, if you play long enough, get all of your stats maxed out. And in Fallout 4, they do use luck as a large component of character improvement. Luck in that game actually provides a pretty diverse and an impactful and viable way of making your character feel powerful. And Elden Ring, I think, could take from it and maybe learn and take their own spin on how to expand luck in their game. One of the ways that is pretty common in RPGs across video games is the notion of a crit. Obviously, in Elden Ring, you have the backstabs as well as the stance break critical blows. However, there's no like actual crit in the sense of using a normal standard attack and it just happens to do more damage than normal. They could easily implement a crit system where you have a percent chance to deal bonus damage on attacks, and your luck could affect the chance of that bonus damage and how much bonus damage, or just one or the other. Another idea that I had, which would be a little bit more interesting, is with regard to the enemies that have the golden glowing eyes that drop more runes. I don't want to be confused with talking about the enemies that have madness. These enemies are not necessarily afflicted with madness. They are instead just able to drop more runes and function exactly the same otherwise as their other AI counterparts. They are a fun little way of getting more runes in the game because of the 5 times return from defeating them. And so on the enemies that drop a lot of runes, you can get a big boon for killing that enemy. Luck could easily be implemented to increase the amount of instances where you find enemies with these golden glowing eyes. It would be a fun way of proving and really showing the actual impact of luck in the game, and you could use it as a way of leveling up faster, of course buying items from vendors and a multitude of other things. I don't think that implementing that system would be particularly OP or super powerful, but it would certainly be fun and make luck stronger. If you guys have any ideas of how to diversify and expand luck as a concept in Elden Ring, please feel free to share them in the comment section down below. To cap off this video, I would like to express my gratitude to anyone who got to this point in the video. I know this was quite lengthy. I didn't honestly expect it to be as long as it is. Hopefully, if you are like me and you are curious about video game design and system mechanics, there was something that was interesting in this video for you to take away. Feel free to let me know in the comment section what you all think, if you agree with any of my opinions, disagree, and what your thoughts on any sort of interesting ideas would be for expanding luck in the game. Once again, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you around.